John Oliver, did a full segment on harm reduction. So I want to talk a little bit about that today. What he, celebrate the fact that the idea of harm reduction is going mainstream, and like we do, want to talk about the nuances of the segment and what we, if in a perfect world, what would be in that segment, or who would be covering the segment, and what would be omitted from it. So I thought maybe you could start, if any comments on that, either from either direction.
Well, I want to say John Oliver is one of several, but the most extreme in being a straight political commentator. That section that he did on harm reduction, it could have fit in anywhere. I mean, it could have been on, PBS or any kind of a straight MSNBC political spectrum. But in fact, I've never heard anybody mention harm reduction on MSNBC. And Oliver's actually a network TV guy. So it's an example of how screwed up we are around drugs. Our most progressive voices in general are simply incapable of coming to grips with drugs and the idea that drugs are not the source of addiction, that it emanates from social causes. They didn't really transitorily dealt with the deaths of despair thing that came out. But basically, they're back to the straight drugs and alcohol are bad. And alcohol in particular, with drugs, it's the painkiller thing. And you can't read any med page now without seeing a host of negative things about alcohol. It at a time when we're thinking that we're making a breakthrough and a revolution in harm reduction. And harm reduction means accepting that people use drugs and certainly that they drink alcohol, and recognizing that that's an ongoing part of our lives, and that we need a backup system that can't, people, in a way, the most progressive people have the hardest time getting that into their heads.
Joe Biden mentioned the term harm reduction in his State of the Union speech, but that's different. That's him taking a term that he realizes is attached to a voting block and using it so that they hear it and say, "Yeah, he mentioned us." I don't imagine that Joe Biden, despite some changes of heart or at least changes of politics recently, I don't imagine Joe Biden ever getting on the stage and saying, there's a swath of the population that uses drugs despite our intentions otherwise, or best efforts, or our beliefs. So we need to make sure that they stay safe. He's just not saying that. And you don't hear that on a mainstream show. John Oliver, I mean, he's a comedian, but somehow he's got to make the stupidity of our politics. That sort of lends itself to comedy, I guess, in a way. And he's the only one that I've heard make that statement. Sometimes people, whatever you think, are going to use drugs, illegal drugs, legal drugs. And don't we want to keep them alive? He's sort of asking that rhetorical question.
I do want to, I'd like you to give your reactions to the Oliver piece, but Biden is a remarkable example of drug psychosis. First of all, let me remind everybody that Biden has never had a drink of alcohol or taken a drug in his life. He ran against a man, Donald Trump, who never took a drug or drank in his life. There has never been a temperance president in the United States of America. Washington produced whiskey in his basement, and until he was probably intoxicated most days of his life. Abraham Lincoln was not a drinker, but Abraham Lincoln was very much against temperance. And of course, there's that famous quote when Ulysses Grant showed up and everybody was saying, well, he drinks. And, Lincoln, I can't do a Lincoln imitation, said, can you find out what he's drinking so I can give it to my other generals? the people who were made as the three greatest presidents. And then Franklin Roosevelt had made all of his famous decisions and had all of his famous meetings during his famous cocktail hours in the afternoon. And so people might say, oh my God, America was steeped in alcohol. And in the last election, we had two candidates and we never had a candidate, even William Jennings Bryan was the most important progressive ever. He never got elected. He wasn't actually temperance. We had two candidates who've never consumed alcohol or drugs in their lives. So that's one amazing thing. Biden was in the Senate. The last bill he proposed before leaving the Senate was recognizing the disease of addiction bill. He proposed legislation to officially recognize that addiction was disease. The third point is he did drug test the people who entered his administration. The fourth thing I'll mention, and I don't want to put anybody down in all of this, I don't want to, lean on a family in distress. Joe Biden has two surviving children. Joe Biden has never consumed drugs or alcohol in his life. Joe Biden's two surviving children have both been in and out of rehab virtually their entire adult lives. And, we could devote a whole section to how is it that a man who's never consumed drugs or alcohol has two children whose lives have been completely distracted by it? His daughter's never really had a life. And we're not going to get political about this. Progressives go crazy when you mention the fact that Hunter Biden is being investigated. But he's a man, he's got a lot of troublesome things going on in his portfolio. It's hard to go in and out of rehab and buy a lot of drugs with no visible means of support. You have to come up with some economic model. But why don't you just bring up some of the things that you noticed in that, in his presentation about harm reduction? You felt it went well in many points, just even having the discussion, but there were other points where, not to fault him, because in a way he's as far advanced as even people in drug policy reform.
Right.
Why don't you run with that for a bit?
Right. I wouldn't want to knock somebody who seems to be in the lead of the conversation in the mainstream. You don't want to discourage that way of thinking and, progressive sort of attitude. Well, I think the things I think he got right, just in my view, are, well, first he made that simple statement that there are just people who are going to use drugs. And now more than ever, those drugs are dangerous and unpredictable. And so whatever we do, we need to make sure that people who are using those drugs are going to stay safe, are going to live. We care if our citizens live. Shouldn't that be obvious? And, that sounds so obvious when you put it out there, but, not everyone thinks that. I can't even make that statement without somebody though I know my family or even my circle of friends or colleagues pushing back on it, even though it sounds so fundamentally true.
And in line with that, maybe I'm jumping ahead of the ball, he does talk about drug consumption sites where people don't die, which is like incredibly controversial. The only drug consumption sites that I'm aware of in the United States have been started within the last, I think, 4 or 5 months in New York City.
Yep.
And there's a lot of, is New York City a progressive city? There's a ton of pushback on it, even in New York City. Although, got to give hats off to the new mayor. He and the governor, Hochul, they're not ganging up on it, so there's hope.
Yeah, so he does talk about drug consumption sites. Before even mentioning that, he discusses, I thought he was going to go the wrong direction with this. You saw he talked about fentanyl, and he said, that's the alarming thing is that police officers are going in or emergency rescue teams are going in and they're overdosing on fentanyl. And the worst part about that is it's absolutely full of shit. It doesn't even, that's not a thing, you don't, and it's the idea that people are going in and getting their skin touched by fentanyl or some minuscule piece of dust is in the air and they inhale it and they're overdosing. It's so dangerous because, you're deterring people who need to save people's lives from wanting to do it. And so I thought that was a nice point.
That was super. I mean, that falls in the craziness drug scare thing.
Yeah.
Which we've always had in America. Carl Hart talks about it with meth, kids cutting off animals' heads. And we had it, of course, with crack. It just comes with the Constitution, it seems.
And then he discussed drug consumption sites in which he noted correctly that although they're just beginning in the U.S., at least sanctioned sites, that they've been operating all over the world and nobody has died in one of the sites. So whether you think about them as like a launching pad into better policies, or whether you think about it as just one tool, one mechanism for keeping people alive, or maybe even getting people a sense of connection or talking to each other, then these things are a boon. And at least they're not killing people. The same people who are dying elsewhere may be servicing these sites and then not dying. So, you got to have to say that's...
There's a subtext to the fact that nobody has ever reportedly died at a drug consumption site. I'm going to go back to 1968 when I first got into the addiction field. They did a long treatise on drugs in the New York Times, which I read every word of 30 times. And Charles Winnick said, narcotics, that's what they used to call opioids at all, are not dangerous substances. People use them for decades. We use them in hospitals all the time. It's all about the conditions under which people administer them. And if you have people administering them in the street, you're going to get some negative outcomes. The fact that, the drug consumption sites, they often don't have a doctor. They just have people who kind of know what's going on, and they can usually measure the purity of the drugs. That's all it takes to keep people from not dying from street drugs, opioid related. There aren't a ton of things that safe. And so the constant, if you just say heroin or opioid, people, and run the other direction. I don't want to get, in trouble. Look, Charles Winnick was around for a long time. Opioids are not dangerous substances.
A few years ago, John Oliver had a segment about opioids, in which he described opioids themselves as causing this bad epidemic. And if you want to tie a person to that, then he said pharmaceutical companies are pushing these addictive drugs. Now everyone's addicted. There's the very standard argument around the time, 2016, 2017. And I could imagine if John Oliver was all aboard the harm reduction train at this point, then he might look back at that segment and say, he might mention, I did this piece a while ago. It turns out I got that wrong. But I don't think he thinks he got that wrong. So therein lies my suspicion that there are limitations to views like his. And you've brought one up to me in our correspondence. I think that the way that John Oliver sees harm reduction is very mechanistic in a way. It's black and white, like people deserve to live or not. He doesn't rope in the idea that human beings thrive on connection, communities to contextualize themselves in, and self-agency, and moving forward in life. He sort of leaves it at harm reduction. So he hits all those notes, but I think he falls victim to where I believe harm reduction gets in its own way sometimes. We were talking about this last time, where even people who are boosterish about drug consumption sites often there's a subtext to that where they say, and there's treatment centers inside. So, people who are addicted, they need treatment. And so this is a good way to get people connected, not die. And plus there's treatment there. And so they just can't go all the way with the harm reduction concept from possible harm into living a better life. And so I think that's where he falls short still.
I think there are 2 points in there. One is he's still not doing away with the opioids are bad and deadly, and he's not taking harm reduction to the next step, which is harm reduction is leading a life. You're going to do the best. People survive, even if they're addicted, the best when they're embedded in the social environment, and the community environment, and the healthcare environment. So I'd want to. The idea that opioids are bad is so mystifying, since virtually every American has taken an opioid, synthetic or natural painkiller. And just in the last couple of months, 2 of the, I would call them the most conservative, let's rethink drugs and addiction people, Maya Salovitz and Sally Satel, have written pieces. Sally Satel's was in the Washington Monthly, and Maya, bless her heart, was in the New York Times. And they both made the same point that Jacob Solom made a couple of years ago, that we're killing people. We've been cutting back opioid prescriptions for 10 full years now, and drug deaths are increasing. So we've dealt with that, or you can think about that as a separate category. But all Jacob Solom, Maya Salovitz, and Sally Satel all point out people whose lives were wrecked because it was so difficult to get painkillers. And they all talk about suicides and all. So the fact that they're our most mainstream, I mean, Maya Salovitz is mainstream being a bestseller writer and being favorable to AA, and Sally Satel talks medicalese, and she's a brilliant psychiatrist at Yale. Even they are forced to come out and say, people take opioids all the time. You and I have taken opioids. Well, you said, Maya said, well, if push came to shove, she apparently hasn't any major medical procedures. And yet we still have this incredible fear of even mentioning opioids, let alone taking them, even though people take them. And then the second point that, in terms, obviously Johann's great contribution is to talk about connection as the antidote to addiction and mental health problems. And the fact that, he can write a bestseller about it is, and others, ironically, both the most recent Surgeon Generals have written books about that when they're not in office. Elder, and Murthy, the current one who's back in office. So everybody sort of knows that connection is the answer, and community. And why do you think it is that has to constantly be brought up in a kind of a forlorn way? And of course, Bruce Alexander is somebody who's talking about a big political shift. It's because we can't do it, and we're not doing it. And if anything, we're going in a reverse direction. So the bad news is virtually everybody who spent some time thinking about it comes to the same place. It's just that we can't get to that place.
When it comes to the opioid part, the opioid bit, it's an easy. There comes time in political philosophy, I think, when progressives say, well, what do we do with this mess, though? And then there's some sort of easy solution that says, well, this can't hurt. So with opioids, we can protect people from themselves before they even, are tempted. We could just cut opioid supply. What would that hurt? Not understanding that there are now deadly consequences from the push to reverse the opioid prescribing trend. And then when it comes to something like drug consumption sites or harm reduction in general, there's a mess to clean up where you say the progressive attitude, just temperamentally progressive people want to say, well, we should just take care of people. And I think that the conservative pushback is, well, what are we, just take care of the look for the people who might be dying and take care of them in perpetuity? What is the long-term plan here? Don't they need to take care of themselves? And so the progressive answer is, well, we could sneak in treatment there. They don't know what to do at that crossroads. I don't know who they is, but John Oliver in this case, I would say, or people who are often people who are pushing for good harm reduction measures.
I mean, what's one of the things that's great about Johan is he's about community, and he understands that's not the same thing as let's get everybody treated. In fact, his treatment experiences weren't positive. I was just watching a debate about the whole Will Smith Oscar thing. And one of the women, an African-American woman, said the problem is that African men can't get enough therapy. And both Will Smith and Chris Rock are famous. They talk about their therapy experiences all the time and how they had to learn how to deal with their suppressed anger because they both had violent experiences in the past. The single worst thing, and the thing that I'm definitely going to go down in flames on, is we transition from community to treatment. And the response to everything is, well, we need to have more treatment. America is the most treated, most money spent on all kinds of medical treatment, most money spent on addiction treatment. And we have, out of 196 countries, according to the World Health Organization Global Burden of Disease Study, we have in the bottom 3 in both life years lost for drugs, counting cocaine, heroin, and meth, and mental illness, counting anxiety and depression. The solution to all of those things in America, everybody knows the answer. Every time they put on something about opioids or suicides, they say, oh, consult this 800 number or see your therapist. Every example that we encounter are people that have been enmeshed in therapy. We're not going to treat away America's problems.
Oh, really well put. The last thing I wanted to talk about in this segment is that Louise Vincent is a person who I know, and she headed a group called Urban Survivors Union. And so these are people often in inner cities who use drugs and who have gotten together to help change policies locally. And Louise Vincent, who got like a 10-second clip at the end of John Oliver's show, I should give a little background. The idea for her was that there were advocates who are drug users, and they're pushing for policies. And she realized along the way that she needed to be, and the group needed to be, diplomatic in a sense. So not only if they're asking for policies that help them as groups of drug users for the things that they need to also be willing to at least understand what the opposing arguments are, why people believe them. And so I work as they call it a reverse advisory board. So I'm an advisor, but this reverse advisory board is, I'm not a person who uses illicit drugs often, or at least I'm not a person in the predicament that a lot of people in that group are in. But I am a person who talks with people who at least think about or even make policies. So I'm a good person who is an ally with their way of thinking, and who can also has my ear on the landscape of people who create policies and why they think the way they do. And I've heard her say before that she absolutely thinks that the problem in people's lives who are drug users, when they're using drugs and the drugs make the problems worse, even though the drugs are making the problems worse, the fundamental problem is their lack of connection with the world. So I think she has a deep understanding that, as you have said, lack of connection, that is addiction. It's not even that the antidote to addiction is connection. It follows that lack of connection is addiction. And that means lack of connection to community, lack of connection to resources, lack of connection to skills that would override an addiction problem, or a sense of understanding or prioritizing values, or even an ability or the bandwidth to prioritize values. That's addiction. And with her 10-second segment at the end didn't say that. And I'm worried that the reason that they didn't leave in I wonder if they interviewed her for an hour or something, and then they put in that 10 seconds. I don't think that the show's producers or John Oliver would understand what sentiment to pull out of what she said that would actually make sense.
Well,
So
but we are doing a life process program segment. And, I like to think that throughout, we have a variety of coaches, but I think all of us understand what we're doing is fostering connections. That, we're, of course, we deal with more than drugs. We deal with sex and love and eating and gambling. And our whole program is in fostering connections. There used to be, and it's still around, the concept of the hidden alcoholic or the hidden addict. And, the high functioning alcoholic or high functioning addict. There's no such thing. DSM, the diagnostic manual, says you're in this manual when you're impaired and you have distress. So they're foisting the idea, well, here's somebody who functions well, seems to be okay, and gets on in their relationships. They're actually secretly addicted, or addiction's not actually, other than gambling in DSM, a victim of some other kind of disorder.
Right.
And what we're saying is there are no strings attached here. If an individual comes to you and they're functioning well and they're not in distress, ergo, they don't have an addiction problem. Maybe they have a guilt problem around something they're doing, pornography or drugs or something. And that's something we can address, but that doesn't fall into the addiction bailiwick.
You'd say addiction would be that sort of an issue, whatever it was that you were just describing, even if it's guilt or some interpersonal problem, to the extent that that pulls your life away from a distress-free way of living, then that would be considered an addiction. Yeah, well, I'll say bravo to John Oliver and that team for taking on the concept, and bravo to the people who are advocating for harm reduction, and so that it's more than just a spotlighted thing here and there that's contentious. It's something that perhaps is in the water. So people are thinking about it and absorbing the idea that at least people deserve common decency. And I guess the next tick up that we'll have to take care of is that people just still suffer from the idea that they can't get beyond mythology in order to go all the way with that concept and really improve lives at the ground level. That's what our program is. And it always has been a way of just peeling back the layers of what it means to have a life problem and getting so down to earth and commonplace that the conversations that you have with another person, that I might have as a coach in the program with another person who feels they're in distress, you almost have to look back and say, are we still talking about addiction or drugs or alcohol, or are we just talking about like who I am as a person? And that's where we want to get.
And one of my colleagues, he characterized my approach as being, it's pretty simple, 3 words: get a life.
I like that.